Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is week 11, Samurais and Sombreros.
Yeah.
All right, it's good to be back, Alex.
Welcome back to the podcast.
And this is our first week that was suggested by you guys, the listeners.
Yeah, and might I say, good choice. I'm excited to do this. We're kind of rolling it over from Miyazaki last week into a bit of a Japanese film miniseries, which I really dig, and this is a really interesting contrast.
Yeah, we'll have a couple more of these coming up, and it's going to be a really cool look at sort of comparing cultures and different filmmaking styles from completely different parts of the world.
Yeah. And this week we're going to start off by taking a look at, our theme this week is Samurais and Sombreros, but as you might have noticed, the two movies we're taking a look at this week are Seven Samurai and The Magnificent Seven. The one from 1960, not the one from 2016.
Right. So The Magnificent Seven is more or less directly adapted from Seven Samurai. And there are actually a couple of American Western films which are directly derived from samurai films, and specifically Akira Kurosawa films. So that hence our Samurais and Sombreros little theme. And we've got a couple of these episodes that we'll be doing over the next couple months. So it'll be fun because I really like Western movies. So this was a fun look at some of the things that have given genesis for some of the most classic Western stories out there.
Right. They tend, you see this interplay between samurai films and Western films a lot, and we're going to take a look at that, and it's going to be a very interesting comparison to see the similarities in the storytelling and how the differences in the culture express themselves. But for now, let's take a look at our two films briefly before we really dive into our analysis this week. Our first film, and the first one that was made, is 1954's Seven Samurai, which, as we said, was directed by Akira Kurosawa, probably the most famous Japanese director abroad, at least. He's very well known in the West.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially for his Chambara Aiga films and his Jidai Geki films, which, if you don't know, Chambara Aiga films are sword fighting films, and almost all of those are going to be Jidai Geki films, which are essentially just period piece films. But that's what Kurosawa excelled at, especially the period pieces. Not all of his, though, were sword fighting films. He had a lot of range. But we're going to be taking a look at one of his most famous Chambara films this week, Seven Samurai, which is all about swords and the characters who wield them. But one other thing to note about the culture behind this film is that this was made in 1954, which was just a year or two after the U.S. occupation of Japan ended. And the Japanese economy was experiencing a bit of a boom, along with the global economy, and the Japanese film industry was experiencing a boom alongside it. So there was a lot of technology starting to flood into the country in terms of filmmaking, and a lot of money for filmmaking as well from the studios, the Japanese studios.
Yeah, and with the U.S. occupation ending, the censorship of more feudal Japanese-centered films was relaxed because that was kind of a thing that was holding a lot of Japanese directors back from the different kinds of stories that they wanted to make. So now we're getting a lot more freedom of expression and more cultural heritage in those films. And then we're going to transition to The Magnificent Seven, directed by John Sturges, who was influenced by Akira Kurosawa films. Like a lot of directors in the 60s and 70s, kind of that film brat generation, were at this point taking a lot of inspiration from Japanese cinema. And this is at the very end of the studio system in Hollywood. But let's dig in and talk about Seven Samurai, one of the most iconic films in film history, really.
Yeah. And as I break down the plot for our listeners here, you might notice that the plot points sound really familiar. And that's probably because you've seen some movie in some part based off of Seven Samurai. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking
archetypal.
about. Yeah. There's a lot of archetypes within the characters themselves. But anyway, so Seven Samurai is set in 16th century Japan, where there's a lot of bandits roaming the country. A certain set of bandits threatens a certain village, and that village, in turn, recruits some samurai to defend them. And the whole movie, which is a pretty long one, by the way, it's about 3.5 hours, is going through this whole process of recruiting the samurai and then defending the village against successive waves of bandits. And we'll get into the character details in a second, but they don't just chronicle the survival of the village, but the tension between the samurai and the villagers, and the samurai and themselves. And it gets into some really nice characterization. But those are the broad strokes of what this movie is about and what almost every Seven Samurai adaptation is about, is a village under threat, normally by a group of bandits or some kind of warrior clan, and then them recruiting some other warriors to defend them from those bandits.
Yeah, the story is almost Shakespearean in its simplicity and timelessness, in the fact that you can pretty much adapt a story about a group of people who have been taken advantage of, wanting to basically hire muscle to get the upper hand of the bullies. It's just interesting that it's so fundamental to kind of the human experience that it can be adapted in so many different ways. And I know Shakespeare was a huge influence on Akira Kurosawa, and I think we can definitely see that in some of the stories that he created, because I know he co-authored pretty much all of his films throughout his career.
Right. Kurosawa is definitively an auteur. He not only co-wrote almost all of his movies and directed them, but he also edited them most of the time the night of. So he would shoot a day and then he would go start cutting that night, as long as he could stay awake, and then repeat it the next day. So he definitely took a lot into his own hands. And you're right, he did several other adaptations of Shakespeare's stories directly into Japanese movies.
Yeah, and you can definitely see his methodical approach to filmmaking in all the aspects of it, especially the cinematography. It's really reminiscent of, Stanley Kubrick films, who is notorious for doing hundreds of takes to get his framing and his scenes exactly the way that he wanted to. But this film is actually in 4:3, so it's a full screen aspect ratio, and it's in black and white. But each shot is so perfectly framed and choreographed so that the movement of the action inside the frame and the movement of the camera all line up to perfectly line up with the story that's going on in front of the camera. Right.
And just, the meticulousness of the lighting is insane. It's so pretty. These like group shots with 3 or 4 people in them, and they each at different distances from the lens, even if it's 1 or 2 feet between each person, and they have these perfect edge-like glows on them in an exterior shot. It's incredible. And it makes sense because Seven Samurai was shot over the course of an entire year. So they definitely took their time shooting this movie. And Kurosawa innovated with a few different techniques through the money that came in through Toho Studios, which funded Seven Samurai. He was able to do stuff like multi-camera shoots for the action scenes, which, on one hand helps you shoot a whole lot faster, and it helps with consistency in editing because you're cutting from one single action where you have multiple angles. And that was fairly new at the time in 1954 to do that on a movie set.
And another thing that was pretty new or not widely used on films in Japan at the time is the telephoto lens. So this is a lens that you can basically zoom in and out on, like we're pretty used to nowadays. But this allows you to quickly change your focal length and get different shots and stuff without having to switch out different lenses. And it also lets you get shots at kind of in between focal lengths that you may not have a specific prime lens for, but that might actually work out better for your shot. So he was really kind of a pioneer of different kinds of film technology, and definitely a master of using all the tools at his disposal to tell his stories. So another thing that I want to talk about is the character development in this movie, because like we said, the story is pretty archetypal and pretty universal. So the variable in each of these adaptations, or specifically the Magnificent Seven, is the characters and how much we get to know about them, and the differences in who they are. So the interesting thing about Seven Samurai is that since it's black and white, and you've got, I feel like black and white films really need to make special effort to differentiate characters, especially when you're working on an ensemble film where you've got essentially 7 main characters. You have to be able to tell them apart from each other. And one way that Kurosawa does this is using costuming. He also changes facial hair and hairstyles. So, for example, the leader samurai that they meet pretty early on, the first thing that we see is he is going to save this child who's been kidnapped by a hungry thief. And in order to rescue him from this hut, he pretends to be a monk. So he shaves his head. And so for the rest of the film, it's easy to track which is kind of, the wise leader samurai, because he has the bald or kind of buzzed head because his hair starts to grow back a little bit. And then also each of the samurai has a little emblem on the back of their tunic that helps you tell them apart, because they're each different. So they're not all dressed the same. And another point early in the film when they are going to find the samurai is the way that you can tell who they go to this village with lots of people coming in and out, this kind of open market kind of thing. And the way that the audience can tell who the samurai and who the normal people are is obviously their swords. So the swords are black, and these long objects that each of the samurai are carrying with them, and most of the tunics are very light colored, so it's easy to identify instantly, oh, that's a samurai, or oh no, that's just another peasant walking around.
Right, because when we're looking at Seven Samurai, especially in 16th century Japan, we're definitely looking at a very distinct feudal culture with a very distinct social strata, where you can tell all the peasants literally grovel in front of the samurai whenever they ask them anything. And a lot of the samurai are very stuck up, even though they're essentially bums at this point, wandering around hoping somebody will pay them to fight something. They're very stuck up when somebody, quote unquote, beneath them is trying to talk to them. And that's something that Kurosawa and a lot of Chambara directors of that era were very fond of criticizing in their films was those social strata. But it does help. You're right. It does help a lot to determine who's who in terms of characterization, which is helpful because an ensemble cast of 7 men roughly the same age is really hard. Otherwise it'd be
all
really
the same
hard to tell them
ethnicity.
apart.
Yeah,
I have a
exactly.
really hard time even on like American gangster films. I get so confused because they're all wearing fedoras and I'm like, what? You all look the same.
Exactly.
But it is interesting in Seven Samurai to look at the way they characterize, because as we're going to see in Magnificent Seven, they do it slightly differently. In Seven Samurai, they tend to focus more on groups. So the villagers definitely have a few distinct characters that stick out within them, like the lead aggressive guy, Rikichi, and the old man who's kind of like the village elder. So you can definitely tell they like to do characterization less individually and more as a group. There are definitely individuals who stick out, but you tend to see these 3 big groups interact within the film: the samurai, the villagers, and the bandits. The bandits are basically faceless. I mean, they have a leader who has like a big fancy helmet, but we don't
like
even
an eye patch or something, right?
yeah, and an eye patch, and we don't even learn his name. They're just kind of like this faceless evil that exists within the film. And for the most part, the villagers kind of have a hive mind. You know, there's a couple people who stick out, like Rikichi, who's like the more aggressive villager in recruiting. There's the old man, who's their village elder. And there's Manzo, who is the villager who hides his daughter from the samurai. And of course, his actual daughter, who falls in love with one of the samurai. But for the most part, they kind of act as a hive mind. But the samurai themselves, we actually only get to see really deep characterization on a few of them, not all of them. There's the leader, Kanbai Shimada, who's the guy you were talking about who shaved his head. And we get to see how he deals with leading the samurai and fighting what feels like a losing battle. And we get to see the young man who he recruited, who isn't really a samurai yet, but it is from a samurai clan. He's like a young rich kid who's trying to prove himself, essentially.
He's a samurai in training, very excited to be kind of given this chance to do what samurais really do.
Yeah, and he falls in love with one of the villagers' daughters. And then there's Kikuchio, who's played by the fantastic Toshiro Mifune, who, if you don't know who that is, he's essentially the Japanese Clint Eastwood, or Clint Eastwood is the American Toshiro Mifune, depending on how you look at it. But Kikuchio's almost ends up being the main character of the movie. He's just a peasant boy who was saved from a raid at some point. His family's dead. He's an orphan who's pretending. He's showboating. He's pretending to be a samurai, even though he's not. But he ends up fighting alongside the 7 samurai. But there's also a few samurai who, like the wood chopping samurai, who you don't really get a lot of characterization from.
Well, he's the one, because I'll say that I think each of these samurai are pretty distinct, and some of the changes that they make later on are something we could talk about, because the wood chopping samurai actually I felt was kind of important because he was the one that had a sense of humor that they brought. He wasn't the greatest samurai in the world, but he's a good samurai and he had a sense of humor, so they bring him in order to keep their spirits high in the dark battle that they're about to go to, because they all know that it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah, you're right. They definitely end up working really well as a unit. Like, those 7 samurai just click together really well.
Yeah, there really wasn't a lot of infighting within the samurai themselves. There was a little bit of pushback with the kid because they thought he was too young, but then he proved to be very eager. And then there was Kikuchio, who is very unrefined and doesn't act very samurai-ish because, as you said, and as we find out a little bit later in the film, he's from a farmer's family, and wanted to escape that life and do something more and become a samurai. But he ends up proving himself and becoming a very integral part of the team.
You're right. And one other samurai we should mention before we move on is kind of like, he's the oldest samurai, but he's also the best.
I love this guy. Yeah,
he's fantastic. He's like the quiet master. He's always taking naps.
He's basically a ninja.
Yeah, he's so good at just being a swordsman. He's technically a blade master, and we'll see later on how they adapt him. Is essentially an acknowledgement of the fact that he's insanely good with a sword.
Yeah, kind of the quote from the movie that sums him up is they ask him to join their group for this expedition, and he turns them down, and then they, as they're explaining this to some of the other samurai, they say, why? And they say, because he only has one rival, and that's himself, because he's constantly trying to make himself better and beat his last best score, kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. He's a super cool character, but and maybe not that deep of an emotional arc with him, but that's okay because there's an ensemble cast. There's 7 of them, and the emotional weight, really gets carried by characters like Kikuchio and the young samurai Okamoto, apologies, and the kind of general of the group, Kanbai Shimada. Whereas some of them kind of just fulfill important roles in the group, like the woodchopper samurai with his humor, and the master samurai with being a real badass with the sword. So they round each other out in this really interesting way. That's clearly worked because it's been adapted a million times.
So the last thing on Seven Samurai is the way that Kurosawa doesn't. He kind of makes the farmers, whereas I think we've been describing them as, they're the group that's been taken advantage of, and they need help because they're so innocent or whatever. But Kurosawa doesn't really portray them that way. He definitely gives 2 sides of every story, in the fact that we get this idea that the farmers are holding out on the samurai, and at the beginning when the samurai show up at the village, they all hide because they're scared that the samurai are going to take advantage of them, and so they kind of hold out on the hospitality that they could be showing these people who have literally come to save their lives.
For basically no pay, by the way.
Right, yeah, just food, essentially. And the flip side of that is that, the farmers' prejudice against the samurais, and the samurais are kind of are seen as the gruff ruffians, but each of these characters that we see are very different than that. They're a lot more than this tough warrior person. Yeah,
you're right. And they even bring up, it's a plot point in the movie that at one point there was a battle near the village that the villagers weren't involved in, but afterwards the villagers tracked down some of the fleeing samurai and killed them for their armor and their money. And that's revealed over the course of the movie. So there's this question, there's this tension between the villagers who are asking the samurai for help, but they've also killed samurai in the past.
And they clearly don't trust these samurai.
Yeah, and these samurais are helping them, but there's also other samurais out there because, like I said before, in this social system, samurais would only fight. That was their job. That's what they did. They wouldn't do other kinds of work. Like, that was considered demeaning. So they would only fight. Yeah, except for the wood chopper, because he chopped wood. But there's other samurai who have raided villages in the past. So it's this weird cycle where they've kind of ended up making each other into brutes and
now they need each other.
And victims, and now they need each other. They need to come together. And that's definitely a theme throughout the movie, and especially in the fight scenes, is that people are stronger in groups. it's when the raiders get separated and singled out that they get killed. Like it's when other people get singled out that they get killed. In groups, people are strong, and you see those group character arcs throughout the film. And that's kind of part of this being a Japanese film and originating from the Japanese culture. And I don't pretend to know a whole lot about it, but it seems to be communicating in the film that this is one of those things that they value. So that is taking these plot points that I sketched out at the beginning of the summary and this analysis, and kind of looking at what those become in a movie within the Japanese culture. But what if you take those same plot points and were to throw it into a different culture? And I think that's what we're going to take a look at here with The Magnificent Seven, Jonathan.
Yeah, and like I was saying before, that's the great thing about this story, is that it can be adapted in almost a complete 180 into American Wild West kind of a setting. So in The Magnificent Seven, the story is still pretty much the same. There's a little village that's being attacked by raiders that goes out and gets some fighters to come and help them defend themselves. And then they end up fighting off the bandits. So mainly what we want to focus on here are the differences, the changes. We're not making it up that this is an adaptation. It literally says in the opening credits that this is based on the film Seven Samurai.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
This is unashamedly an adaptation, right? So in this film, we have this little village in northern Mexico of farmers, and they are being attacked by this bandit played by Eli Wallach, who people may recognize from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, who plays Ugly. And he's such a great actor, and he does great in this role. He actually died a couple years ago, unfortunately. But the samurai are now gunslingers. So we have cowboys coming in to rescue the town. And now this film is about an hour and a half shorter than Seven Samurai. So there are a lot of things that are kind of condensed or glossed over. And there are just a lot of little individual changes that makes this film distinct from Seven Samurai and makes it its own, while still, like we said, obviously taking inspiration from Akira Kurosawa's film.
Yeah, exactly. So, Seven Samurai came out of that post-occupation Japanese film industry boom, and this is coming out of kind of the last legs of the American studio system in Hollywood. So, just taking a look at any frame of the film would give away that it's from a different kind of
time
like creative
time
source.
And place in the world.
Yeah. Even though they're only 6 years apart, it's definitely from a different source. Because you're looking at, it's in 2.35 aspect ratio in color. So even from the get-go, we're looking at something that's definitely different from Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, just technology-wise. Even though if we're talking about cinematography, I'd probably give the edge to Seven Samurai.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
one of the things we were talking about is that in this film, there are no shots that frame all seven of the gunslingers in like this really cool single shot. They're all like kind of broken off in either close-ups or small groups and stuff, whereas Seven Samurai has plenty of shots that have all seven of them in one way or another, or a couple of them just like perfectly, like we were saying, meticulously framed in little screenshots that could be their own photo.
Right. And, at least I personally think that kind of comes from a big cultural difference. when you look at the Magnificent Seven, and there's a much bigger focus on the individual. Even just starting with the bad guy. The bad guy actually has a name, and he's played by Eli Wallach. Like he's a substantial role within the film. He talks to the heroes, and he has sit downs with the heroes, and bargains with them in a way that just doesn't happen in Seven Samurai. Like in Seven Samurai, the bandits just show up and start attacking people, which gives a different flavor to the movie when there's this personal conflict between a bad guy and the heroes.
Yeah, so another thing that changed is a lot of the personalities of the heroes. One of the biggest changes that I haven't totally decided what I think about it yet is there's kind of this combination of the young, cocky kid and the misfit guy who's kind of grown up from the farmer family and wants to do something more and be the cool, hero kind of character into one character. And I thought that they worked really well separately, and I really liked the character development of Kikuchio, where he starts off kind of wild, for lack of a better word, and as he sees the the gravitas of the situation, he definitely starts to calm down and actually becomes more samurai-like in his demeanor. And the kid also has a similar arc, but I think that I don't know, I do like them as two separate characters. Yeah, and I think that that could have been pulled off in this, and they chose to make a different decision.
Yeah, they definitely went a different route. I think Kikuchio and the young warrior in Seven Samurai were really rich characters with really rich arcs, and it's kind of it's definitely an interesting combination to see them put together, and it helps when you're trying to save an hour on a movie,
right?
But it also loses a lot of character development from a movie, so I think they might have lost that a bit. But we also see shakeups in other characters. For instance, the woodchopping samurai, who, by the way, is also a woodchopping gunslinger in this one. And the gunslingers are just as much bums as the samurai were bums in Seven Samurai.
Well, this is one thing that I wanted to touch on real quick before we talk about the rest of them, is that in this film and also the new Magnificent Seven, which we'll talk about later, I didn't want to get into it right now, but one of the big things about when the villagers go to find the samurai in Seven Samurai is the old man, the village leader, basically says, find hungry samurai, find samurai who need work or need food, because that's what we can provide, Whereas in these films, they kind of gloss over that fact, and they're just sort of looking for anyone who will come and help them out, just kind of for sympathy. And there's a bigger change to that in the new Magnificent Seven, but I just think that's an interesting change in that they're just looking for anyone. They're not looking for kind of a ragtag team of gunslingers. Right.
It kind of ends up being, it feels like it ends up being a ragtag team of gunslingers by chance instead of like a concrete plot decision.
Yeah, it feels more desperate on the part of the farmers if they're looking for the gunslingers who can't get work, or the samurai who can't get work. The ones who aren't being hired by anybody, so they may or may not be any good.
Yeah, and I think it leads to a more interesting arc for the samurai too, because they go from working out of necessity for literally food, so they don't die, to slowly caring about the village.
Well, that's another
or at
interesting
least caring
thing.
about the fight.
Yeah, they become invested in the fight, but at the end, the famous line is, "The villagers are the only winners. We're still losers." So that's kind of the point of Seven Samurai, is that I may be getting a little bit into the spoiler section, but the point of Seven Samurai is that the samurai come and help the farmers, they had no investment in the fight, and they get nothing from the fight once it's over. So they kind of end up as they get the short end of the stick on all accounts. And I think that that's actually not as lost in this one, but definitely lost in the new one. But I won't go there yet.
Right. That's definitely for later. But it's a solid point, and it does impact how these characters interact and develop over the course of the film. But anyway, back to the Woodchopper Knight. I keep calling them knights.
Yeah, you just said knight. I think that's the first time.
I think that's because actually the first version of Seven Samurai that I ever saw was also called the Magnificent Seven, but it was like a 2010 medieval England version of it, and there was a bunch of knights held up in a castle, like a really tiny castle, fighting like 30 Vikings or something. But anyway, the Woodchopper Knight in this one is a lot less funny. And he definitely has a different arc. He has a much more personal arc, actually, in this one, where he's followed around by a bunch of the village kids who repeatedly tell him that they drew lots for each of the gunslingers. And so essentially they're on his team, and if he dies, the gunslinger dies, then they're in charge of carrying his body off the battlefield and then making sure that his grave has fresh flowers on it all the time. He ends up developing this personal connection with the kids, and it matters a lot to him over the course of the movie. And you can tell that he's a lonely person. But it's a lot different from the Woodchopper Knight in Seven Samurai. Pretty much, I think the only connection is that they both were found chopping wood for food. Yeah,
that's definitely something that's kind of like a hint, hint, nod, nod kind of a deal.
Yeah.
Like, in case you didn't realize we're doing a remake. But he does get a really nice moment where he has this little monologue about different kinds of courage, which is actually a theme change in this film that was really nice. But we do lose the character that was the morale boost in the midst of a dark time.
Yeah, and you kind of see that across, and you'll see as we go through this lineup, you kind of see that while the Seven Samurai and Seven Samurai were kind of set up to function really well as a group, the Seven Samurai here are really interesting individual characters, even though they might not make the most effective group.
Yeah, so there's two pretty different personalities that are kind of totally fresh for this movie, which is one cowboy, which I believe he was a war vet from the Civil War. Is that right?
That's what it sounded like.
Okay. And he kind of we get this idea that he has PTSD, and he's very shaken and a little jumpy, and always kind of, he has this underlying fear of what he does underneath everything, underneath all of his gunslinging, activities. And then the other character is one who is just kind of, I don't know, you just call him the greedy character. He's always looking for another angle. Like he's go for it.
That's definitely his thing in this movie. He's constantly he's trying to trick the villagers over the course of the movie into like letting slip there's some secret source of wealth. He like keeps going up to villagers and being like, so you heard about that secret gold mine around here, right? And the villagers like, gold mine? And he's like, I meant silver mine. And and then the villagers still have no idea what he's talking about. But he's just looking for money the entire time. But
he's been told that they're doing the job for nothing, but he doesn't believe it. He believes that Yul Brynner's character definitely has some kind of ulterior motive.
Yeah, but he actually is. He used to work with Yul Brynner's character, the kind of older leader character,
who was actually bald, in order to kind of connect him with our character from Seven Samurai.
Yep, and that's the reason why I will always picture Yul Brynner bald. But he's the old comrade character. He's got a lot of modifications on him, I will say. But there was an old comrade character in Seven Samurai too. He was the one who, true. When he met the leader at the start, he was bragging about having hid in the reeds of some river to survive some battle, which was a big undermining of like samurai as these big noble warriors. Like, no, he hid in the reeds to survive. Like that's what these people are doing, trying to survive.
Right. And I definitely, in this film, I think that the PTSD character works better than the greedy character. Just in the fact that,
for sure,
I don't care about this guy who just wants to make a bunch of money, but I care about this idea of fear and, doing something dangerous even though you're completely terrified of doing it. And that goes into what I was saying about this courage idea that this film plays with, different ideas of courage in, the courage to raise a family life in the midst of
all this violence.
Yeah.
Just a violent place.
Yeah. The courage
there's this constant temptation to revert to violence. Because they talk about that when they're young men. They want to be, they want the gunslinging life. They want to be able to have their gun be their job and nobody talks down to them, and yada, yada, yada. And they think that's courage when they're young. And that's what the young character thinks is courage in the movie. But they're also trying to communicate to him and probably to the audience at large that, that's not all it's cracked up to be. It takes courage to have some self-sacrifice and do things for other people. And you might get more satisfaction out of that too.
Right. It's the idea of, having a stable family life and providing for children and a wife, and the village as a whole, in the face of bandits and marauders, versus just being able to be your own master and do whatever, because that's not quite as noble as it might seem to be when you're young. So these cowboys are definitely each at a place where they're realizing that they haven't done anything as significant with their life as the farmers have, and several of the characters are torn between, having that stable life and continuing with their dangerous life that seems to have less purpose now than it did when they were young and ambitious.
Right, and there's two other characters we should get to. One being the adaptation of the Blade Master or the Swords Master. I called him the Blade Master in this movie because instead of wielding a katana, like a samurai, he throws knives, which is a really interesting adaptation. He has a knife that he throws, true. He also has a gun that he's okay at, but he definitely excels at knife throwing, which is like I think it's a really cool homage to the original one, that they tried so hard to get some kind of bladed weapon into this movie, and I think that was the best they could do. I mean, they couldn't give him a full-out sword. That would be really incongruous and kind of weird, but it's definitely a nice homage to the original.
Yeah, the only thing about the knife is that we see it at the beginning when his character is first introduced. We see that he's as fast with a knife as any other gunslinger is with his gun. And then he doesn't really use it again until the very end. And at the very end, he uses it in a way that actually harkens back to an image from Seven Samurai. So I could definitely see that the knife is put in there just to be an extra tie to Seven Samurai. But I kind of wished it would have been utilized a little bit more in the big battle.
Yeah, and that character didn't have a whole lot of development either. He mostly took naps.
Yeah, he wasn't quite as awesome as the ninja samurai was.
No. Yeah, the guy, the master samurai in Seven Samurai was much better. And there's also the second in command character, the lieutenant character, and this one played by Steve McQueen, who's kind of a fellow gunslinger, a fellow warrior, who the leader, in this case Yul Brynner, meets towards the beginning of the film, and they have a small adventure together, and then they kind of become best comrades. I don't want to say best friends, but a good working duo over the course of the film.
Yeah, and he has a mirror in Seven Samurai 2 where I think it's the first samurai that comes into the little hutch where they're recruiting people.
It is.
And he says something along the lines of best friends can be made by chance encounters or something. And so those two are confidants throughout the film, and that's kind of who Steve McQueen takes that role with Yul Brynner's character.
Right. And Steve McQueen was, like I said, he was a big star at the time. So it's kind of nice it would kind of be nice if he was in the same role as a Kikuchio type, because Toshiro Mifune was, who played Kikuchio, was a giant star in Japan at the time that he played Kikuchio. So that would have been a nice 1-to-1, but it didn't work out.
Yeah, I really miss that Kikuchio character. I wish we could have seen something more distinctly like him in this one, because I really like his arc.
Yeah, and I kind of like the young warrior having his own independent arc with the love story.
That's the other change that we should talk about. Is the fact that in Seven Samurai, the young warrior has this love affair with one of the farmers that we've met at the beginning, who went to go recruit the samurai, his daughter. And we see throughout the film that he's very protective of his daughter and afraid that the samurais are just going to come in and ravage all the women. So he has his daughter, disguise herself as a boy and try to protect her that way, which kind of backfires. But in the Magnificent Seven, we have the same female character, but she is not the daughter of any of the farmers that we know, and it's just kind of a side thing that the young guy falls for her, and it kind of comes together at the end, but it's a little more forced in this one, since we don't have the time to develop it like we did in the other one. Like the love affair played a big part in the conflict between the samurai and the farmers in Seven Samurai, whereas here it's just kind of a B storyline.
And when you look at the conflict in this film, it also plays out quite differently, really, than the conflict in Seven Samurai. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's more focused on these individual characters. So it's a lot more dialogue focused than Seven Samurai, where the second half is essentially a very elongated, very epic series of battles.
It's almost like the D-Day invasion, where it's just wave of bandits.
Right. The bandits just keep attacking. It's so stupid. I don't know why they do that. They must be really stupid bandits, but that's not the point. The point is, in this movie, there is no series of battles. There is a lot of prelude to battle, a lot of tension building up to a battle. There's a little exchange. They do this thing where 3 advanced scouts from the bandits are sent. This happens in both movies, and the 7 manage to take them out. But after that point, the bandits get the drop on the Magnificent Seven and manage to force them out of the village, and eventually corner them again, where they have a one-on-one conversation between Yul Brynner, the leader of the 7, and the bad guy, like the leader of the bandits, So they actually have the sit down conversation where there's all this tension, and then the cowboys are sent out of the village, and then they have to make the decision whether or not to come back and fight it out, which is just a very different way to finish off the conflict than in Seven Samurai, where there is no chance of a peaceful resolution. It's just, we're going to keep fighting until one of the other side is completely dead.
Yeah, and that decision that they have to make at some point where they regroup and are thinking about either calling it quits or heading back, again, plays into this idea of what does courage look like, and who are really the courageous ones in the film. So that's just another nice little way to tie in this new theme that's more explored in this film than in Seven Samurai, which again differentiates it. So with that, let's talk about some overall notes.
Yeah, let's go into the big notes for the week, which I think will be interesting because this is kind of our first compare contrast.
Yeah, it's kind of a spot the differences, which we just went through a lot of.
Yeah. Which is kind of really, because everyone knows I like to get into kind of these meta topics, kind of looking at the anatomy of an adaptation, or we talk about what makes an adaptation interesting. And I think that's what a lot of what we see here. And I honestly, personally, my personal opinion is that Seven Samurai is better than The Magnificent Seven. I still think that Magnificent Seven is a good movie.
An objective fact.
That's fair enough. There aren't a lot of movies that have 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, but Seven Samurai is one of them. But it's I think what makes The Magnificent Seven stick in my head, even though it isn't a masterpiece of a film, is spotting the differences between Seven Samurai and The Magnificent Seven, and looking at those conscious choices and decisions that create a new and different film, even though it's based on the same foundations, and where those come from, whether they be cultural, whether they be authorial, who's the director in each case, whether they be logistical, one takes place in Japan, one takes place in northern Mexico, one is created by a famous Japanese director who's really big into Japanese culture, and one happens in America by kind of like a classic studio Western director.
Yeah, I think, like you were saying, that the Magnificent Seven also kind of sticks with me, but I think that like you were saying, that it manages to be its own film, and that's kind of what I really enjoy about it. Even though it's not even my favorite Western film, it manages to have its own themes, and it creates its own thing. It's not just shot for shot remake exactly one to one. Yeah, it takes inspiration from a great movie and has some fun with it, and manages to tackle some different ideas and make itself a completely distinct film. And I think that's really what all film sets out to do. And if all you're doing is literally taking another film and transporting everything from it into a different costume and a different climate, then you're not really making a new film.
Yeah. So there's still a lot of similarities between these films, and that's really interesting. And spoiler alert. Seriously, spoiler alert. One of the key similarities between the two films is that only 3 of the heroes survive. 4 of them die. I hope you were paying attention when I said spoiler alert, because I just said it twice. A fair warning was given. But yeah, so 3 heroes survive. There's some reiteration of the line at the end that it was the villagers win, not the samurai or the gunslingers win. There's always a village that's under threat. There's always bandits. There's always heroes, and those similarities are, those are the archetypes that form the basis of the Seven Samurai story, and those are the things that are kind of kept super similar if adjusted when you're making a new movie. So adapting to the Magnificent Seven, you took samurai and made them into cowboys. And I think one of the most interesting reasons that works so well is that it's not just that a bunch of Westerns stole from samurai films. Kurosawa watched a lot of Westerns. He was heavily influenced by Westerns when he was doing his work. And then in turn, those influenced a lot of Westerns again.
It's that idea of art recycling itself, like we talked about in the Wes Anderson episode.
Exactly. And if you can track that iteration from this to this to this, and see how it changes over the years, because they're still making Magnificent Seven movies, and they're gonna keep making them. And for whatever reason, they've decided to completely remake the original. I don't know why, but they are.
I actually do want to talk about that. Can we talk about that movie?
We will talk about that movie. Okay. But I do just want to say that one of the reasons why I like Seven Samurai so much is that you have that clear tracker. It's super obvious when somebody's taking from Seven Samurai, and we'll get into it here in a little bit, where there's some unexpected films that are Seven Samurai remakes, ostensibly.
Or you can make a strong case for it.
Or at least you can make a really strong case for it. And authorial intent doesn't mean anything once it's been made. Like, once it's been made, the audience pretty much gets to decide the rest.
I don't know if I believe that, but that might be a longer conversation.
How about let's say it's a mix. It's a mix of authorial intent, which is ever present, and the audience can bring their own point of view to the table.
Okay, because I definitely see film and all art as a communication medium, so I think that finding what the author was intending when they created it is one of the main things about any kind of art analysis.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's what we're doing here. So
absolutely
makes total sense.
Can I talk about the new Magnificent Seven now?
Yes, please talk about the new Magnificent Seven.
Okay. So the new Magnificent Seven keeps the same story and turns it into a cartoon. Basically, each of these characters. So we've kind of described the different personalities of the samurai and the gunslingers in the Magnificent Seven, and so they were distinct and they were archetypal. And in the Magnificent Seven, they are essentially turned into cliches of different kinds of characters. So we have the big guy and we have the knife guy. Literally now has 12 knives on his belt that he throws all the time. And there's the Indian one and the Mexican one. And they're just it's kind of taking this archetypal thing and just, throwing layers of cliche on top of it. And then there's other small things. I mean, the movie was fine. I'm gonna nitpick the crap out of it, but
I mean, that's what we do.
Overall, it was a fine movie. It was fun. Go watch it. But I think that if you remove the title, The Magnificent Seven, and just kind of dissociate it from Seven Samurai, then it would be just as enjoyable, I guess, to what extent that is. Because it kind of misses the point, like we were talking about with the idea that the samurai lose in the end because they are doing this because they kind of have nothing else to do. They don't really have any stakes in this fight. In the Magnificent Seven, they actually give the cowboys a stake in the fight. Like they actually have Denzel Washington's character actually has this big beef with the main bad guy, and so
it gets personal.
By the time
Like
he's
super
defeated,
personal.
by the time he's defeated, it's not just the villagers who've won; it's Denzel Washington who's won because he's got his revenge now. So I think Seven Samurai is a Shakespearean tragedy essentially by the end, and
totally.
That's lost with the Magnificent Seven, the 1960 version, when it's given a bittersweet ending, a little bit of a happy ending for one of the cowboys, and in the Magnificent Seven when it's more or less victorious. Also, I don't even know if I can call this Magnificent Seven film, because I would argue that there's actually 8 of them, because they make that one of the farmer wives actually ends up becoming like one of the gang. So there's
she plays a really big role.
Yeah, and she's just as good with her rifle as any of the rest of them. So it's kind of the Magnificent 8.
They kind of separate her out from what is normally that homogenous herd of villagers, and kind of like try to pop her into her own character. And you're right, kind of turn it into the Magnificent 8.
Right, and one of the characters in this one leaves for a time, and I thought, okay, so she's the 7th one now, because he left before the fight started, and then he comes back. So it's like, okay, who are the 7 exactly? It's like The Hobbit, The Battle of Five Armies, where Peter Jackson never actually told us which were the 5 armies.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we were talking about with a remake influencing a remake influencing a remake. It's like this weird game of telephone, where the 1960 version of the Magnificent Seven was an adaptation of Seven Samurai. But I would say the 2016 version isn't really an adaptation of Seven Samurai. It's just an adaptation of the 1960 version of
I was thinking
Magnificent 7, and it's like I enjoyed it as a blockbuster. Like it was a good fun movie. But I didn't think Seven Samurai when I watched it. I thought this looks like the older Magnificent 7.
Yeah, it wasn't a deep movie in the way that Seven Samurai like kind of leaves you with a weight when you're done. It was definitely a let's blow things up and shoot things and have this wacky cast of characters, that instead of looking for a group, they just kind of find them on the way. And yeah, as I was watching the film this week, I was honestly asking myself, has this person ever actually seen Seven Samurai, this director? Because I could find almost no traces of it in the film.
Yeah, it's just communicated out of it. And I think there's been a couple other Magnificent Seven reboots in between the 2016 one and the 1961. And the 1961 was actually like a quadrilogy. They made a few after it that, at least according to IMDb, were not so great. So I haven't seen them personally. But
right, it's just this kind of thing where Hollywood finds something that works and then does it over and over and over again, to get as many people to pay for it as possible.
Yeah, it's reached a point where the Magnificent Seven has a lore and a remakeability within itself, so that is what's getting remade now.
And if you want to go back to our star-driven films again, that's all Magnificent Seven is. Like, it's Denzel Washington and Chris Pratt and Ethan Hawke, and Matt Bomer is super high up on the cast list, even though he was in it for 5 minutes at the beginning of the movie.
Wasn't he the guy who got shot?
He gets shot within before the title sequence, so I don't even know if that counts as a spoiler.
Oh no, that's not a spoiler.
He's the husband of the woman who becomes the 8th Magnificent Seven.
Yeah. The new archetype, the widow.
Right.
But yeah, that star power thing, we were talking about that in the Oscar bait episode a lot, where that is kind of what attracts a lot of people to movies when we're talking at least about blockbusters and big, like, well marketed movies. Well, like when we talk about movies where their marketing budget exceeds their production budget, that's what we're talking about.
The trailers for Magnificent Seven were actually quite different than the film itself in the fact that they were all set to like hip-hoppy rap music with the slow motion, and like I remember things from the trailer that I don't remember even seeing in the film when I watched it this week.
Oh yeah, that's super common. That's super common these days.
Yeah, but it's all just to make people go watch it and pay their money and get a little bit of distraction out of it, but no substance.
Yeah. But anyway, before we get too bitter,
too late.
Let's transition and look at some of the differences between our two movies for the week. If you've forgotten, The Seven Samurai and The Magnificent Seven.
Oh yeah, back on track.
Yeah. And I think you know what I came away as the biggest difference was the cultural difference. Maybe a little bit from the places they were being made, which was, you know, pretty modern Japan and America, but more from the places they were set. Where in the Seven Samurai, there are all these like really beautiful group shots, and a lot of what the interaction between the characters is dictated by this social system and the social hierarchy, like this social feudalism, literally, that existed in 16th century Japan. And then if you look at the Magnificent Seven, we're talking about Western rugged individualism. And you can see that again in the cinematography, where there's a lot more single shots. And like you said earlier, there's no good tableau shots of the Seven in the Magnificent Seven, 1960. So you see that difference. And also they're characterized much more individually in the Magnificent Seven, like I mentioned earlier, and more as a group, like we were mentioning with how they function, the ensemble's cast of samurai characters function well as a group in the Seven Samurai. So that's just what I found so interesting, was this adaptation that came to a different culture, a different time, a different place, and how the different thoughts of how society works here influenced how the characters came across on screen.
Yeah, and that's not to say that the characters weren't individually developed in Seven Samurai, or they didn't work well as a group in. It's just that there's just kind of this overarching focus that just seems a little different from a different cultural mindset. And there's another element in Seven Samurai that this element of group shots and group movement that kind of accents individual movement. And we have a link to a video from a channel called Every Frame a Painting that kind of explores the way that Akira Kurosawa uses movement in all of his images. And he has a little section in there that breaks down a scene from Seven Samurai and shows how the movement of one of the samurai bowing in respect to the first samurai who's fallen ripples throughout the rest of the villagers as they all bow, and it makes his movement that much more powerful.
Yeah. Well, all of the movement in the Magnificent Seven tends to be a lot more individually reactionary motivation.
Frenetic a little bit.
Yeah. And I also know that, like we mentioned before, there have been a few other remakes that were, let's call it non-traditional. A couple non-traditional adaptations, and I know you were excited to find one of those this week, Jonathan.
Yeah, so as I was watching Seven Samurai, a story about these bandits who are stealing this wheat crop from a bunch of farmers with a hive mind, and a couple of them get sent off to find warriors. I was reminded of a Pixar movie called A Bug's Life, where the same thing happens in an ant colony, where they're raided by grasshoppers led by Kevin Spacey, and one little ant goes off to find some warriors and comes back with circus clowns. And I thought, if that isn't the definition of a parody, I don't know what is.
Yep. You heard it here. Well, maybe not first, but definitely definitively.
Akira Kurosawa's A Bug's Life.
Akira Kurosawa's A Bug's Life. Oh, man. Disney.
And we've also found through research that there's a film called Battle Beyond the Stars, which is kind of an intergalactic sci-fi adaptation where aliens from a bunch of different planets or whatever come together and it has the same kind of story, but we haven't seen it. We don't know much about it. But if you're feeling adventurous, go seek out Battle Beyond the Stars, especially because apparently it's inspiration for the new Justice League movie coming out.
Yeah,
help us all.
Oh, man, that'll be interesting. And tweet us what you think about those, especially Battle Beyond the Stars, because neither of us have seen it. And
Sell us on it.
Right. I would also like to ask any adventurous viewer or any adventurous listeners out there to help me find a movie. I swear that at one point in time, I have watched an adaptation of The Magnificent Seven that was set in medieval England, and the king and 6 of his most loyal knights defended this tiny castle against this horde of, I think, Frenchmen, invading Frenchmen. And it had a pretty high production value too. Like it was a well-made movie, even though their castle was tiny. But for the life of me, I cannot find what this movie is. So if you know what it is, please tweet me and tell me what it is, because I would like to know. I would like to watch it again.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too. I like night stories, but I have never heard of this. So we'll see. Right.
And coming up next week, if we're going to take a look at the movies for next week, we are going to be covering some of the best movies by director John Hughes, famous for his 1980s high school films, which is also kind of the reason that I wish I went to high school in the 80s, but I'm way too young for that.
Alex has nostalgia for a lot of time periods, if you haven't found out.
I really do, but I don't want to go any time period before 1900 because I don't have any vaccines and I die from smallpox.
There you go.
I'm just saying, that's a logical point. So we're going to be watching 1984's 16 Candles, then 1985's The Breakfast Club, and then 1986's Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is available on Netflix if you would like to watch it there. But yeah, he had a very compact directorial spurt. He also wrote all of these movies, and I'm super excited to get into them. Big hair, big pop music, sweaters everywhere. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it'd be lots of fun.
Right on. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at jssatchel.wordpress.com/blog.
Talk to you next week.
All right, see ya.